A lonely widow paid $2 for a giant mountain man with a sack on his head at auction, and the whole town thought she'd lost her mind. But out on that quiet ranch, behind closed doors and whispering pines, something strange began to stir. The man never spoke, never ran, but he worked like a soul bound by more than chains. Folks said he came from the mountains with blood on his hands. Others said he'd been marked by something worse. She just saw a man no one else dared to look at twice. But when boots thunder and old secrets ride into town, one question will decide everything. Was this widow's kindness a miracle, or a mistake waiting to catch fire? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The autumn wind rustled through the cottonwoods as Clara Bellamy pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wooden auction platform creaked under the weight of shuffling feet, its rough planks weathered from years of similar gatherings. Around her, the townsfolk of Mercy Ridge clustered like nervous chickens, their whispers carrying on the crisp September breeze. Clara stood quietly at the back of the crowd, her gray-streaked hair tucked neatly beneath a modest bonnet. The sheriff's voice rang out across the town square, calling out lot numbers and starting prices for the day's labor contracts. Most were familiar faces. Tom Wheeler, the baker's boy caught stealing again. Old Mr. Peterson, deep in debt from the saloon. Clara's heart ached for them, but her meager widow's purse couldn't help them all. "Lot number 17, the sheriff bellowed, his voice cutting through the morning air. Two deputies led forward, a sight that made the crowd gasp and step back. A man, taller than any Clara had ever seen, shuffled onto the platform in iron shackles. A dirty burlap sack covered his head, but his massive frame spoke of strength barely contained. His clothes were ragged, but his back was straight despite the chains. "Found wandering near Miller's Creek," the sheriff announced, adjusting his gun belt. "No papers, no words, no trouble neither. Strong back, good for farm work. Opening bid at $2. The crowd muttered and shifted. Someone spat in the dust. "Ain't natural, being that big and quiet," a woman whispered nearby. "Like something from them dime novels." Clara's hand moved before her mind caught up. $2, she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The crowd turned to stare at the widow Bellamy, known for her sensible ways. The sheriff waited, but no other bids came. "Sold to the widow Bellamy for $2, he declared, bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack. Clara approached the platform, fishing in her reticule for the coins, her last $2 meant for winter supplies. Her fingers trembled slightly as she signed the ledger, but her signature was clear and firm. The deputies unhooked the chain that bound the silent giant to the platform. The walk home was long and quiet, with only the creak of her mule cart's wheels and the shuffle of feet in the dust. The man followed without resistance, though Clara noticed how he turned his covered head at every sound, alert as a wild creature. Evening found them in her ranch kitchen, the lamp casting warm light on the scrubbed wooden table. Clara had served a simple supper of beans and cornbread, watching as her strange guest ate with careful, measured movements despite the sack and shackles. Now she approached him with her husband's old toolbox. "I'm going to cut those chains now," she said softly, the way she might speak to a spooked horse, "and then we'll take that sack off, if you're willing." The man sat perfectly still as she worked the file against the iron links. The only sound was the rasp of metal and the tick of her grandfather's clock on the mantel. When the shackles finally fell away, he slowly rubbed his raw wrists but made no other movement. Clara reached for the sack, her movements deliberate and gentle. "I'm Clara Bellamy," she said, drawing the rough fabric up and away. "And I reckon you'll need a name, silent or not. I'll call you Elias if that suits." The face revealed in the lamplight caught her breath. Despite the wild, grizzled beard and the dirt of imprisonment, there was a dignity in his features that prison hadn't erased. But it was his eyes that held her, golden as autumn wheat, filled with a sadness so deep it made her own heart ache in answer. Elias made no sound, but he met her gaze steadily. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding perhaps, or the first fragile thread of trust. Clara nodded once, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. "Well then, Elias," she said, turning to pour him a cup of coffee. "Welcome to your new home." Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pink and gold as Clara stepped onto her front porch, coffee cup warming her hands. The sound of splashing drew her attention to the well, where Elias was already at work. His massive frame moved with surprising grace as he hauled bucket after bucket, filling the household water barrels without having been asked. Clara watched, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. Over the next several days, a pattern emerged. Each morning, she'd wake to find Elias already tackling some necessary task. The woodpile grew taller than she'd ever seen it, neat rows of split logs stacked with careful precision. The broken fence rails that had worried her all summer were replaced one by one, the new wood fitting seamlessly with the old. On Thursday, she found him on the barn roof, hammer in hand, replacing the worn shingles that had leaked during last spring's rains. Though he still hadn't spoken a word, his actions spoke volumes about his character. He worked with quiet purpose, each task completed thoroughly and well. "Land sakes, Clara Bellamy, what possessed you to take in that giant?" Mrs. Peterson called over the fence one afternoon, her eyes wide with curiosity and something like fear. "Ain't natural, him being so quiet-like." Clara continued hanging her wash, smoothing one of her husband's old shirts that now served Elias. "He's the best help I've had since Thomas passed," she replied evenly. "Does more work than 3 ordinary men?" "That's what worries folks," Mrs. Peterson persisted. "Where'd he get such strength? And why won't he speak? Mark my words, there's something wild about him." Sunday morning arrived clear and crisp. Clara laid out her best dress and Thomas's old Sunday suit, which barely fit Elias's broad shoulders. "Church is important in these parts," she explained as she adjusted his collar. "I'd be obliged if you'd come with me." The small clapboard church sat proudly at the edge of town, its white paint bright in the morning sun. As Clara and Elias approached, conversations died away. Women clutched their children closer. Men's hands strayed toward their belts. Clara held her head high, nodding politely as she led Elias to her usual pew. Preacher Mayfield stood at his pulpit, his lean face stern as he surveyed his congregation. His eyes lingered on Elias before he launched into his sermon, his voice thundering through the small space. "The wages of sin is death," he proclaimed, gesturing dramatically, "and the path of the wicked leads only to destruction." Throughout the fierce sermon, his gaze returned again and again to the silent giant in Clara's pew. After the service, Clara lingered near the church door, exchanging pleasantries while Elias waited patiently beside the hitching post. Snippets of conversation drifted to her ears. "That's him all right, the one they found up by Elk Pass. Half dead, they say, covered in blood. Never said a word in all those months in jail. Must be touched in the head." The whispers followed them down the dusty street. Clara's spine stiffened with each murmur, each sidelong glance. That evening, after seeing Elias settled in the barn with his supper, she marched straight to Preacher Mayfield's house. The preacher answered her knock, looking unsurprised to see her. "Sister Clara," he said gravely, "I expected you'd come." "Tell me what you know about Elias," she demanded without preamble. Mayfield sighed, gesturing her to a chair on his porch. "They found him last spring up near Elk Pass. He was badly hurt. Knife wounds, they reckoned. Sheriff's men brought him in, but he wouldn't, or couldn't, speak a word about what happened." "Was he charged with something?" "They held him for months trying to figure out who he was, what happened. No charges ever stuck, no evidence of wrongdoing, but no answers either." The preacher leaned forward, his face troubled in the gathering dusk. "Sister Clara, I know you have a charitable heart, but taking in a stranger with such a mysterious past, it's risky." Clara stood, smoothing her skirts. The Good Samaritan didn't ask for references before helping his neighbor, Preacher Mayfield. And I've seen nothing but honest work and gentle ways from Elias these past days. "Just be careful," Mayfield called after her as she descended his porch steps. "Even the devil can appear as an angel of light." Clara walked home through the deepening twilight, her mind churning with all she'd learned. The man working so diligently on her ranch carried deep mysteries, and perhaps deep wounds. But watching him these past days, she'd seen something the gossips and fearmongers had missed: a profound dignity, a careful gentleness that no amount of suspicion could erase. The autumn air turned crisp as September deepened into harvest time. Clara stood at the edge of her hayfield, watching the golden stalks wave in the morning breeze. Frost would come soon, too soon, and the hay needed cutting before the cold could claim it. She turned to Elias, who stood quietly beside her, his golden eyes taking in the expanse of work ahead. "We'll need to bring this in quick," she said, more to herself than to him. "Weather's fixing to turn." They worked steadily through the morning hours. Clara guided the horse-drawn mower while Elias followed behind, gathering and binding the cut hay into neat bales. His massive hands worked with surprising deftness, each bale tied tight and uniform. The sun climbed higher and sweat soon darkened his shirt, but he never slowed his pace. By midday, they had cut and baled a good portion of the field. Clara brought out a jug of cool well water and some bread and cheese. They sat in the shade of an old oak tree, sharing their simple meal in comfortable silence. Clara had grown used to these quiet repasts, finding an odd peace in them. There was something restful about not having to fill the air with words. That evening, after their usual supper of beans and cornbread, Clara went to her bedroom and returned with a worn leather Bible, Thomas's old one, its pages soft with use. Without ceremony, she placed it on the small table beside Elias's pallet in the barn. He glanced at it, then back at his hands, making no move to touch it. Clara nodded, understanding that some things couldn't be rushed. 3 days later, they hitched up the wagon to fetch water from the well near Widow Jansen's property. The morning was cool, dust rising from the wagon wheels as they made their way down the rutted road. Clara held the reins loosely, letting the horses set an easy pace. A child's scream split the air. Clara jerked the reins, but Elias was already moving. He launched himself from the wagon with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, covering ground in long strides toward young Samuel Jansen, who lay sprawled in the dust. A rattlesnake coiled mere inches from the boy's leg, its warning rattle cutting through the morning stillness. In one fluid motion, Elias scooped Samuel up with one arm while his other hand found a fist-sized rock. The snake struck empty air where the boy had been. Elias's throw was lightning quick and deadly accurate. The rock crushed the serpent's head with a single blow. Samuel clung to Elias's neck, sobbing. The big man held him gently, patting his back with a careful hand until Widow Jansen came running from her house, her face white with fear. "Samuel, oh my Samuel!" She gathered her son into her arms, looking from the dead snake to Elias with wide eyes. "You saved my boy," she whispered. "God bless you, sir. God bless you." Elias ducked his head, backing away from their gratitude. He returned to the wagon, his movements now somehow smaller, as if trying to make his giant frame less noticeable. By supper time, the story had spread through Mercy Ridge like wildfire. Clara heard versions of it from 3 different neighbors as she picked up supplies at the general store. The silent giant had moved like lightning, they said, had the reflexes of a wildcat, saved little Samuel Jansen quick as thinking. That evening, Clara made a special supper, a thick beef stew with dumplings using some of her precious stored vegetables. As she set the bowl before Elias at the kitchen table, she spoke softly. "Thank you for what you did today. That boy would have died if not for you." For the first time since she'd brought him home, Elias lifted his eyes to meet hers directly. Something moved in their golden depths. Pain, perhaps, or memory. Then he bowed his head, a gesture both graceful and profound before turning his attention to his meal. Clara watched him for a moment, struck by the contradiction of this man, capable of such swift, decisive action, yet wrapped in such deep silence. Whatever wounds had stolen his voice, they hadn't touched his fundamental decency. Of that she was now certain. The morning sun filtered through the barn doors as Clara carried fresh eggs to the kitchen. She paused, noticing something different about Elias's usual morning routine. There he sat on his pallet, Thomas's old Bible open in his weathered hands. His fingers traced the lines of text slowly, brow furrowed in concentration. Clara set down her basket. "Would you like me to read it to you?" Elias looked up, something vulnerable in his golden eyes. He gave a slight nod. That evening, after the dishes were cleared, Clara lit an extra lamp and opened the Bible. "We'll start at the beginning," she said softly. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. As she read, Elias sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Only the slight rise and fall of his chest showed he was breathing. When she finished the chapter, Clara closed the Bible gently. "Shall we pray?" He bowed his head alongside her, and though he made no sound, she sensed a deep reverence in his silence. This became their evening ritual. Each night after supper, Clara would read a passage. Then they would pray together, her words carrying both their hearts to heaven. Sometimes she caught him mouthing the words of familiar verses, though he never spoke them aloud. 10 days into this new routine, Clara hitched up the wagon for a supply run into town. The general store was busy with ranchers stocking up before winter. As she examined a bolt of wool fabric, a sharp voice cut through the general murmur. "Fort Keene business, ma'am. Agent Silas Lowe." Clara turned to see a lean man in a crisp uniform, his manner as starched as his collar. He was speaking to Mrs. Peterson about Indian affairs matters, but his eyes swept the store like he was taking inventory of souls. Clara gathered her purchases quickly, something about the agent's presence setting her ill at ease. She had nearly reached the door when Lowe's voice rang out again. "Widow Bellamy, isn't it?" She turned, forcing a polite smile. "Yes, sir." "I understand you made an interesting purchase at the labor auction recently." His tone was casual, but his eyes were not. "Good day, Agent Lowe," Clara said firmly, and stepped out into the autumn sunshine. The afternoon light was fading when Ernie Malloy's wagon rattled up to her fence. Clara saw him from the kitchen window where she was preparing supper. Elias was in the barn, mending tack. "Evening, Ms. Bellamy," Ernie called out as she met him on the porch. "Wondered if I might borrow a shovel. Mine's got a broken handle." "Of course, Ernie, let me fetch one from the barn." But Ernie was already walking that way, and before Clara could stop him, he'd pushed open the barn door. Elias looked up from his work, and Ernie stumbled backward. "Lord Almighty," he muttered, his face draining of color. "Ain't that the mountain ghost from Elk Pass?" "Ernie," Clara started, but the man was already backing away. "Folks talked about seeing something up there last spring. Something big that moved like a shadow. Never thought—" He scrambled onto his wagon. "Keep the shovel, Ms. Bellamy." "I'll make do." Clara watched him drive away, dust rising behind his wheels. When she turned back to the barn, Elias had disappeared into the shadows. The next morning dawned gray and cool. Clara was just setting out feed for the chickens when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Agent Lowe sat straight-backed on a bay horse, 2 deputies flanking him. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, dismounting, "I believe we need to discuss your laborer." Before Clara could respond, Elias emerged from the barn. Lowe's hand moved to his pistol. "Well," he spat, "if it ain't Elijah Cross himself." Scout turned savage. His voice dripped with contempt. "Accused of killing Lieutenant James Harper near Comanche lands last spring." Clara's heart seemed to stop. She turned to Elias, but he stood motionless, his golden eyes fixed on the agent. "You bought yourself a murderer, widow," Lowe continued. "This man betrayed his post, went native with the Noconi band, then put a knife in his commanding officer's back." The morning air grew thick with tension. Clara's mind raced through every quiet moment, every gentle action she'd witnessed from Elias, or Elijah, over the past days. The careful way he handled the horses, how he'd saved young Samuel, his reverence during prayer. "He's been accused," she found herself saying, "but has he been proven guilty?" Lowe's eyes narrowed. "That's what I aim to find out." Agent Lowe's boots crunched on the gravel as he stepped closer to Clara's porch. "Hand him over, Mrs. Bellamy. Save yourself the trouble." Clara lifted her chin. "Do you have a warrant, Agent Lowe?" "A warrant?" He laughed without humor. "For a contract laborer? For taking a man into custody." Clara's voice remained steady. "Show me the law that says I must surrender him. Show me the proof of his crimes." The agent's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, widow. This man is dangerous." "All I've seen is honest work and gentle ways," Clara said. "Until you bring me proper papers or real evidence, Elias stays." Lowe's jaw tightened as he mounted his horse. You'll regret this foolishness." He wheeled his bay around, and his deputies followed, leaving clouds of dust in their wake. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Through her window, she watched Elias's shadow pace the length of the barn, back and forth, like a caged mountain lion. The moonlight caught his profile now and then, head bowed, shoulders heavy with some invisible weight. When dawn broke, Clara found him already at the water pump filling the troughs. She walked straight to him, her heart pounding but her voice clear. "Did you do it, Elias? Did you kill that lieutenant?" Elias set down the bucket. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his hat and knelt before her in the dirt. His big hands clasped together in prayer, and though no sound passed his lips, his whole body seemed to tremble with shame. Clara saw tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. Before she could speak again, thunder rolled across the hills. Dark clouds gathered quickly, bringing the promise of heavy rain. They worked fast to secure the livestock and equipment, but the storm hit hard. Wind howled through the valley, driving sheets of rain sideways. Through the downpour, Clara heard an awful cracking sound. The South Corral, already weak from summer rot, was giving way. Their two best horses nickered in panic as posts began to snap. Without hesitation, Elias plunged into the storm. Clara watched from the barn door as he wrestled with broken rails and posts, his shirt plastered to his skin. Hours passed, and still he worked, securing crossbeams, hammering stakes, bracing corners. The rain never let up, but neither did he. When darkness fell, Clara had to call him in. He stumbled through the barn door, shivering and bleeding from where splinters had torn his hands. She led him to the kitchen, where the stove's warmth began to thaw his frozen fingers. "Let me tend those cuts," she said softly, bringing her medicine box to the table. As she cleaned his wounds with whiskey and wrapped them in clean strips of cloth, she noticed old scars crossing his palms, marks of a life spent working, building, protecting. 3 days later, Clara was gathering eggs when she heard hoofbeats. Her heart jumped, fearing Lowe's return, but it was just young Tommy from the telegraph office holding out a letter. "From South Rock Agency, ma'am," he said. "Reverend Tusk's reply to your inquiry." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. The Reverend's careful handwriting filled the page. "Dear Mrs. Bellamy, your letter regarding Elijah Cross brings both joy and sorrow to my heart. Joy to know he lives, sorrow for his current circumstances. I knew him well during my time with the Noconi Comanche, where he served as both Army Scout and adopted brother to the people. Few men have walked the path between two worlds with such honor and wisdom. The Noconi called him Silent Eagle for his keen eyes and thoughtful ways. He learned their language, respected their customs, and helped maintain peace through many difficult seasons. The tribe's elder, Two Elks, considered him a son. I cannot speak to the specific charges against him, as I was transferred before those events. But I know Elijah Cross to be a man of deep faith and unwavering loyalty. Whatever happened near Elk Pass, I trust there is more to the story than Agent Lowe's accusations suggest. May God guide you in showing mercy to this good man. Yours in Christ, Reverend Isaac Tusk." Clara folded the letter carefully, watching through the window as Elias groomed the horses. The morning light caught his face, peaceful in the simple task. "A man between worlds," the Reverend had said. Perhaps that was why God had brought him here, to her land between the settlement and the wild, where grace might build a bridge across the divide. The Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Clara hitched the wagon while Elias readied the horses, his movements careful and precise. They had 5 miles to cover, heading east toward the Comanche borderlands where prairie met sky. Clara had packed bread, dried meat, and a small pot of coffee. The wooden wheels creaked beneath them as they followed the old trading path, marked by scattered buffalo bones and wind-worn stones. Elias sat straight beside her, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the rising sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and pink. The landscape changed gradually, settlement fences giving way to open grassland dotted with sage. Prairie dogs stood at attention as they passed, chirping warnings to their underground kin. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the morning thermals. Near midday, they crested a low rise overlooking a shallow creek. There, beneath a lone cottonwood tree, sat an elderly man wrapped in a blanket decorated with geometric patterns. His silver hair hung in 2 long braids, and his face bore the deep lines of many winters. Elias's breath caught. He climbed down from the wagon slowly, reverently, and approached the seated figure. Without hesitation, he knelt and pressed his forehead to the earth, his broad shoulders trembling slightly. The elder, Two Elks, rose with dignity. He placed weathered hands on Elias's shoulders and spoke soft words in Comanche, his voice rich with emotion. Then he drew Elias up into an embrace that spoke of years of shared history and lost time. Clara remained by the wagon, giving them space for their reunion. She watched as Two Elks touched his forehead to Elias's in a gesture of deep kinship, murmuring what seemed like prayers or blessings. Finally, Two Elks turned to Clara and beckoned her forward. "You have shown kindness to my son," he said in clear English. "Please, sit with us. There are truths that must be spoken." They settled in the shade of the cottonwood. Two Elks produced a small pipe, lit it with ceremony, and passed it in a circle before beginning his tale. "2 winters passed," he said. "When the snows came early, our people camped in the protected valley near Elk Pass. We had permission. The treaty was clear. But a new lieutenant arrived, young and full of poison thoughts. Two Elks' eyes grew distant with memory. He ordered the camp burned. No warning, no cause. Elias was their scout then. He tried to stop it, showing them the treaty papers. The lieutenant tore them up. Clara glanced at Elias, who sat with his head bowed, hands clenched tight. "When the soldiers came with torches, Elias fought his own men to save our little ones. He carried 2 children through the smoke to safety. But the lieutenant's men caught him." Two Elks' voice grew heavy. "They beat him until he could not speak, then left him for dead in the snow." The old man reached into his blanket and withdrew a small wooden token, smoothed by age and decorated with careful carvings. "We found him, barely breathing, nursed him through fever dreams. When he woke, his voice was gone, locked away with the horror of that night." He pressed the token into Clara's hands. "This marks him as Nokoni, our brother. The army tells lies about a murdered lieutenant, but the only crime was theirs, and they hide it behind false words and threats." Clara traced the carvings with her finger, a soaring eagle surrounded by symbols she didn't understand, but felt the weight of. The truth of Elias's silence finally clear. Not guilt, but deep trauma and betrayal. As the sun set, they made camp near the creek. Two Elks shared more stories of Elias's years with the Nokoni, his skill with horses, his respect for their ways, his quiet strength. The stars emerged one by one, filling the prairie sky with ancient light. In the deep of night, Clara woke to a sound she had never heard before. Deep, racking sobs. Elias knelt at the edge of their camp, his massive frame shaking as years of stored grief finally found release. Two Elks sat beside him, one hand on his back, singing softly in Comanche, a song of healing, of return, of pain finally spoken. Clara watched them through tears of her own, understanding now the full measure of God's purpose in bringing this wounded soul to her door. The wooden token pressed against her heart where she had tucked it into her dress pocket, a tangible piece of truth in a world too often clouded by lies. The autumn wind rattled dry leaves against the window panes as Clara stood before her stone fireplace. In her hands, she held the wooden token Two Elks had given her, its carved eagle catching the flickering lamplight. With gentle reverence, she placed it on the mantel beside Thomas's worn Bible, her late husband's most precious possession. The 2 objects seemed right together somehow, both testaments to faith and honor. The evening shadows had just begun to lengthen when heavy boots thundered across her front porch. The door burst open without a knock, and Roy Greeley stumbled in, his face flushed with drink and anger. The sharp smell of whiskey filled the room. "Evening, Widow Bellamy," he slurred, swaying slightly. His usually neat clothes were disheveled, and his eyes had a dangerous gleam. "Come to discuss business." Clara straightened her spine, though her heart hammered. "Mr. Greeley, this is hardly the time or manner for a proper discussion." "Proper?" He spat the word. "Ain't nothing proper about you denying water access to honest ranchers. My cattle are dying while you hoard that spring." That spring has been deeded to this property since my husband's time, Clara said firmly. The town council confirmed those rights last season. Greeley took an unsteady step forward. Times change, woman. Drought's getting worse. I'm offering fair money for those rights. More than fair. His voice turned ugly. Course, if you're too stubborn to see sense, accidents do happen, especially to widows living alone. A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias emerged from the kitchen doorway, his massive frame filling the space. Though his face remained calm, his golden eyes held steel. Greeley whirled around, nearly losing his balance. Well, if it ain't the murderous savage himself, he sneered up at Elias. You think hiding behind this half-breed will save you, widow? He'll bring nothing but trouble. Clara moved to stand beside Elias. You're drunk, Mr. Greeley. I suggest you leave now, before you say something you'll regret come morning. Regret? Greeley laughed harshly. Only regret I got is not running this monster off my range when we first found him. He jabbed a finger toward Elias. You watch yourself, Indian lover. Your kind ain't welcome here. With that, he stormed out, letting the door slam behind him. His horse's hooves pounded away into the gathering dusk. Clara's hands shook as she latched the door. Elias touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of quiet support, before moving to stoke the fire. 3 days passed in watchful tension. Clara noticed Elias taking longer routes during his chores, circling the property's boundaries. He began carrying tools that could double as weapons, a shovel while checking the fence line, an axe while gathering firewood. On the 4th morning, while Clara was feeding the chickens, she heard Elias's sharp whistle from the direction of the well. She hurried around the barn to find Greeley there, stone sober this time, examining the well's pump mechanism with calculating eyes. Elias stood 10 paces away, gripping a long-handled shovel. His stance was relaxed but ready, like a mountain lion before it springs. Greeley's hand twitched toward the pistol on his hip. Just inspecting the water table, widow. Public right-of-way and all. This is private property, Clara called out clearly. As you well know. The two men locked eyes across the dusty yard. Though Elias held only the shovel, something in his unwavering gaze made Greeley's face twitch. After a long moment, the rancher backed away. This ain't over, he snarled. Town water vote's coming up. We'll see who's got rights then. He swung onto his horse and spurred it hard, cursing as he rode off. That evening, Clara wrote by lamplight at her kitchen table, carefully forming each word. Dear Preacher Mayfield, I write requesting your mediation at the upcoming water rights vote. Recent events have made clear the need for peaceful resolution to these disputes. Mr. Greeley's behavior grows concerning, and I fear violence may result without intervention. As a woman of faith and a longtime member of your congregation, I ask for your wisdom in this matter. Your sister in Christ, Clara Bellamy. She sealed the letter with a drop of wax, then turned to find Elias watching her from his place by the fire. His eyes held understanding. He knew the stakes as well as she did. Water meant life out here, and some men would stop at nothing to control it. But as Clara looked at his steady presence, she felt her fear ease. God had sent her not just a worker that day at the auction block, but a protector. A man who had already proved he would stand against injustice no matter the cost to himself. The autumn sun cast long shadows through the church windows as folks filed in for the special meeting. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of nearly every soul in Mercy Ridge. Clara sat straight-backed in her usual spot, Elias a silent mountain beside her. She could feel the stares, hear the whispers. Preacher Mayfield stood at his pulpit, his weathered Bible open before him. Brothers and sisters, he began, his voice filling the small sanctuary. We're gathered today to discuss the matter of spring water distribution. These are trying times with the drought testing us all. Roy Greeley shot to his feet before the preacher could continue. Testing some more than others, ain't that right? He turned to face the congregation. While my cattle die of thirst, Widow Bellamy sits pretty on the best water source in the county. Clara felt her cheeks flush but kept her composure. The wooden pews squeaked as people shifted uncomfortably. And that ain't the worst of it, Greeley continued, jabbing a finger toward Elias. She's harboring a killer, A man who murdered an army officer in cold blood. Ask yourself, can we trust such people with our water? Murmurs rippled through the church. Clara saw heads nodding, faces darkening with suspicion. Even some of her longtime neighbors wouldn't meet her eye. Mr. Greeley. Clara stood slowly, her voice clear and steady. I remind you that the United States Army never charged Elias with any crime. In the months he's lived and worked among us, he's done nothing but good. He's fixed fences, helped with harvests, and shown himself to be a God-fearing man. That's right, came a voice from the back. Sarah Jansen rose, her young son Samuel clutching her skirts. That man saved my boy's life, snatched him right from the jaws of a rattler without a thought for his own safety. She lifted her chin. That's not the action of a killer. The devil can appear as an angel of light, someone muttered. Preacher Mayfield raised his hands for quiet. I've watched this situation closely, he said, his deep voice commanding attention. When Elias first came to our church, I confess I had my doubts. But I've seen him bow his head in prayer, work honest hours, and treat others with respect. He paused, looking directly at Greeley. Perhaps we should judge less by rumors and more by the fruits we see before us. The meeting continued for another hour, voices rising and falling like waves. Some sided with Greeley, speaking of property rights and the needs of their own farms. Others remained silent, uncertain. No clear resolution emerged. When they finally adjourned, the sun was setting. Clara and Elias rode home in the gathering dusk, the clip-clop of hooves the only sound between them. His face remained impassive, but Clara noticed how his shoulders seemed heavier than usual. That night, Clara woke to an odd scraping sound. The moon was high and bright, casting silver light across her yard. Following the noise, she found Elias behind the barn, stripped to his waist despite the cool night air, digging steadily. He had already carved a long trench stretching toward Widow Jansen's property line. Clara watched as his muscles flexed in the moonlight, the shovel biting deep into the earth. She understood immediately. He was creating a channel to share their well water with their struggling neighbor. Elias, she said softly. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at her with those golden eyes. Still no words, but his meaning was clear. They had been blessed with plenty, and it was right to share. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. This man who had been shown so little mercy by the world was working through the night to help others. She thought of the Savior's words about giving cups of cold water in his name. Let me fetch you a lantern, she said. And I'll bring some water too. The digging kind, not the sharing kind. His eyes crinkled slightly at her small joke, the closest she'd ever seen to a smile. As Clara turned back toward the house, she knew this quiet act of generosity would speak louder than any words in their defense. By morning, news of Elias's nighttime labor would spread through town, and hearts would begin to soften one by one. The first frost came early that year, painting the windows with delicate white patterns and turning the morning grass brittle. Clara had been working hard to prepare the ranch for winter, mending quilts and storing preserves when the fever struck her like a hammer blow. It started with a shiver she couldn't shake, even beside the cook stove. By nightfall, she could barely stand. Elias found her swaying in the kitchen, trying to lift a pot of soup with trembling hands. Without a word, he guided her to her bed, his large hands gentle but firm on her shoulders. The next few days blurred together in a haze of heat and chills. Through the fog of fever, Clara was aware of Elias's constant presence. He moved like a shadow through her room, changing cool cloths on her forehead, stoking the fire, and spooning warm broth between her cracked lips. When she shivered, he added another quilt. When she burned, he opened the window to let in the crisp autumn air. In her more lucid moments, Clara noticed how he never left her side for more than a few minutes. He slept in the wooden chair beside her bed, his long legs stretched out, head bowed in what looked like constant prayer. The ranch work must have been piling up, but he seemed concerned only with her recovery. What surprised her most was the sound of his voice. At first, she thought she was dreaming when she heard the low, melodic rumble of someone reciting psalms. But there was Elias, his eyes closed in concentration, speaking words she had read to him so many times. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. His voice was rough from disuse, but clear and strong, like water over stones. He had memorized every word of their evening readings, and now he gave them back to her as medicine for both body and soul. The fever peaked on the 5th night. Clara tossed in sheets soaked with sweat, her breathing shallow and quick. Through the pounding in her head, she heard movement beside her bed. Elias had fallen to his knees, his big hands clasped together, head bowed low. "Heal her, Lord," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "She saw me when I was no one." Those simple words, the first he had spoken in English since coming to her home, pierced straight through Clara's fever-addled mind. Tears slipped from her closed eyes as she listened to this man, who had carried such heavy silence, finally breaking it to pray for her healing. The fever broke the next morning. Clara woke to pale sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of birds greeting the day. Her nightgown was damp with sweat, but her head was clear for the first time in days. Elias was dozing in his chair, his face peaceful in sleep. She noticed his clothes were wrinkled and his beard untrimmed. Had he really stayed beside her this whole time? As if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened. They looked at each other for a long moment, and Clara saw relief wash over his features. She tried to speak, to thank him, but her throat was too dry. Understanding immediately, he brought her a cup of water, supporting her head as she drank. By the end of the week, Clara was well enough to move around the house again, though Elias insisted on doing the heavier tasks. She found herself watching him through the window as he split wood for her fire, fed the livestock, and checked the fence lines. All the work he had somehow managed to keep up with while tending to her. One morning, she came down to the kitchen to find something on the table that made her catch her breath. There, beside her empty coffee cup, sat a perfectly carved wooden flower. Each petal was lovingly shaped. The stem curved gracefully. Even tiny leaves curled along its length. It must have taken hours to make, whittled in the quiet moments while she slept. Clara picked up the flower, running her fingers over its smooth surface. It was a columbine, the same kind that grew wild in the meadow where she and her late husband had often picnicked. Somehow, Elias had noticed which flowers she loved best, though she had never told him. She held the carving close to her heart, understanding all it represented: gratitude, care, and perhaps something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. His silence had ended in prayer for her, and now this gift spoke volumes more. God truly worked in mysterious ways, she thought, bringing healing not just to her body, but to two lonely souls who had found each other in the most unexpected circumstances. The morning of the water vote dawned clear and cold. Frost glittered on the wagon seat as Clara and Elias set out for town, their breath forming white clouds in the early light. Clara noticed how Elias sat straighter than usual, his shoulders tense beneath his worn coat. He had spoken little since his prayer during her fever, but his eyes held a new openness when they met hers. They were halfway to town when hoofbeats thundered behind them. Clara pulled the wagon to a stop as Agent Lowe and 4 cavalrymen surrounded them, rifles raised. "Elijah Cross," Lowe's voice cut through the crisp air like a knife. "You're under arrest for desertion and the murder of Lieutenant James Harrison." Clara's heart jumped into her throat. "You have no right?" "I have every right, ma'am." Lowe produced a wrinkled paper from his coat. "Federal warrant signed last week. Your pet savage is going to face justice." Elias remained still as stone, his golden eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Only the slight trembling of his hands betrayed his emotion. "Please." Clara stood up in the wagon, her voice steady despite her fear. "At least let us present our evidence. 2 Elks and Reverend Tusk can testify to what really happened." Judge Allen, who had been riding to town for the water vote, approached on horseback. He reined in beside the wagon, his weathered face grave as he studied the scene. "Agent Lowe," the judge said, "I understand you have a warrant, but I've known Clara Bellamy 20 years, and if she says there's evidence to consider, I'm inclined to listen." Lowe's jaw clenched. "This isn't a territorial matter, Your Honor. It's federal." "Even federal authorities should welcome the truth," Judge Allen replied. He turned to Clara. "I'll hold a hearing. 1 week from today. Bring your witnesses." "The prisoner stays in my jail until then," Lowe snapped. Clara watched helplessly as the cavalrymen surrounded Elias. He climbed down from the wagon with quiet dignity, allowing them to bind his wrists. Before they led him away, he turned to Clara and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of trust that brought tears to her eyes. "I'll be back," she called after him. "I promise." The town jail was a small brick building with iron bars on the windows. Clara insisted on seeing Elias settled inside before she would leave. The cell was cold and bare, with only a narrow cot and a tin cup for water. Elias sat on the cot, his large frame making the space seem even smaller. "I'm riding to South Rock tomorrow," she told him through the bars. "I'll bring back Reverend Tusk and 2 Elks. We'll show them the truth." Elias nodded once, his eyes meeting hers with the same steady trust she had come to depend on. Clara reached through the bars and squeezed his hand briefly before turning away. She had to move quickly now. South Rock was 2 days' hard ride each way. Dawn the next morning found Clara already in the saddle, her fastest horse beneath her and provisions packed for the journey. She had spent the night preparing, writing letters to everyone who might help. Preacher Mayfield, the Jansons, even Roy Greeley, who had softened since Elias dug the water trench to help his neighbors. The autumn sun climbed higher as Clara rode east, her thoughts never far from that cold cell and the man who had changed her life with his silent strength. She would not fail him. God had brought them together for a purpose, and she meant to see it through. The road to South Rock stretched before her like a promise. Clara touched the wooden token from 2 Elks, which she wore on a leather cord around her neck. It would guide her back to those who could speak for Elias when he could not speak for himself. Justice would be served, but not the kind Agent Lowe had in mind. She spurred her horse faster, racing against time and distance. Somewhere behind her, Elias waited in his cell, trusting her to return. And return she would, with the truth that would set him free. The sleet stung Clara's face as she urged her horse forward through the gathering storm. 2 days of hard riding had left both beast and rider bone-weary, but she couldn't stop. Not with Elias counting on her. The normally 2-day journey to South Rock stretched longer as icy rain turned the trail treacherous. Night was falling when she finally spotted the reservation's wooden cross rising against the purple sky. Her horse's hooves clattered on the frozen ground as she approached the mission house where Reverend Tusk lived. The elderly Reverend opened his door at her knock, lamplight spilling onto the porch. "Mrs. Bellamy?" His eyes widened with concern. Come in, you're half frozen." Clara's hand shook as she accepted the cup of hot coffee he pressed into them. Through chattering teeth, she explained about Elias's arrest and Agent Lowe's accusations. The Reverend's face grew grave as he listened. "I'll testify, of course," he said. "Elijah Cross was a man of honor. The Army's treatment of him was shameful." 2 Elks, Clara managed between sips. "I need to speak with him too." "He's been expecting you," Reverend Tusk said softly. "Said the signs told him you would come." They found 2 Elks in his cabin near the edge of the reservation. The elder sat cross-legged before a small fire, as if waiting for them. His weathered face creased with recognition when Clara entered. "The widow who sees with her heart," he said in careful English. "You have ridden far for my brother." Clara knelt before him, exhaustion forgotten. "Please, they're going to try him for murder. We need your help." 2 Elks reached into a leather pouch at his waist and withdrew a folded paper, yellow with age. "I have carried this many moons, waiting for the right time. Now I give it to you." Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "I, Captain William Dawes, being of sound mind and near death, must confess what I witnessed 2 winters past. Lieutenant Harrison ordered the burning of the Comanche winter camp against direct orders and treaty law. When Scout Cross tried to stop him, Harrison had him beaten and left for dead. The lieutenant's death came by his own men's hands when he ordered them to fire on fleeing women and children. Cross is innocent of all charges. May God forgive us all. Signed, Captain W. Dawes. Witnessed by 2 Elks, Noconi Elder." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, tears mixing with the melting sleet on her cheeks. "This will save him." 2 Elks nodded solemnly. The dying man spoke truth. Now you must carry it home. The return journey began at dawn. Reverend Tusk rode beside Clara while 2 Elks followed on his pony, wrapped in a thick blanket against the cold. They traveled slower than Clara wished, but the icy trails demanded caution. As dusk approached on the first day back, they sought shelter at the Mercy Creek Mission House. Sister Mary Catherine welcomed them with hot stew and beds near the kitchen fire. After their guests settled for the night, Clara slipped into the mission's tiny chapel. Moonlight filtered through the single window, casting silver light on the rough-hewn cross. Clara sank to her knees on the hard wooden floor, clutching her husband's worn Bible to her chest. "Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking, "why does my heart ache so? He's barely spoken 10 words to me, yet I feel his silence like a missing limb." Tears flowed freely now. "I'm 52 years old, a widow, set in my ways. What business do I have caring this much for a man I hardly know?" But she did know him, she realized. Knew his gentle heart in the way he handled frightened calves. Knew his honor in how he worked without complaint. Knew his faith in his reverent handling of Scripture despite being unable to read it. Knew his courage in how he faced the town's suspicion with dignity. "I promised my Herbert I'd keep his land safe," she continued, touching the Bible's worn cover. "But maybe you sent Elias to help me do that. To help me live again, not just survive." The chapel's silence held her confession tenderly. Outside, an owl called softly in the darkness. Clara remained kneeling, letting the truth of her feelings wash over her like a cleansing rain. She had 4 more days to reach town before the hearing. 4 days to save a man who had already saved her in so many ways. Finally, peace settled over her like a warm blanket. She didn't have all the answers, but she had truth in her saddlebags and faith in her heart. For now, that would have to be enough. The church bell tolled 9 times across Mercy Ridge's town square, its solemn peals echoing off the frost-covered buildings. Townspeople filed into the courthouse, their boots scraping against wooden floors as they settled onto hard benches. Morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Clara sat in the front row, her spine straight despite her exhaustion. Reverend Tusk sat to her right, his clerical collar stark white against his black coat. 2 Elks occupied the space to her left, dignified in his traditional dress, drawing curious glances from the assembled crowd. At the judge's bench, Mr. Allen adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The sound cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. "This hearing concerns the matter of Elijah Cross," Judge Allen announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Agent Lowe, you may present your case." Agent Lowe rose from his seat, boots clicking as he approached the bench. His uniform was pressed crisp, his manner rigid with authority. "Your Honor, the accused deserted his post as Army scout and was present at the death of Lieutenant Harrison. The Army seeks justice." "And the defense?" Judge Allen's gaze swept to Clara. Clara stood clutching her reticule where Captain Dawes's letter lay folded. "Your Honor, we have evidence that will clear Mr. Cross's name." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she withdrew the yellowed paper. Reverend Tusk rose beside her, lending quiet support with his presence. "This is a deathbed confession from Captain William Dawes, witnessed by 2 Elks of the Noconi Comanche." Judge Allen accepted the document, unfolding it carefully. The courthouse fell silent as he began to read aloud, his clear voice carrying Captain Dawes's last words to every corner of the room. "I, Captain William Dawes, being of sound mind and near death, must confess what I witnessed 2 winters past." As the judge read, Agent Lowe's face darkened like a thundercloud. The truth emerged piece by piece. Lieutenant Harrison's violation of the treaty, the illegal order to torch the winter camp, Elias's desperate attempt to prevent the atrocity, the beating that left him for dead, and finally, Harrison's death at the hands of his own men when he commanded them to fire on fleeing women and children. When Judge Allen finished reading, the silence in the courthouse was absolute. He looked up, removing his spectacles to study the document more closely. Two Elks, you witnessed this confession? Two Elks rose with quiet dignity. I did. Captain Dawes spoke these words with his last breath, seeking peace before meeting the Great Spirit. Reverend Tusk? The judge turned to the clergyman. I can attest to Elijah Cross's character during his time as scout, Reverend Tusk stated firmly. He was a bridge between our peoples, respected by both sides. His only crime was trying to prevent a massacre. Agent Lowe surged to his feet. This is preposterous, a convenient tale from a dying man who can't be questioned. Agent Lowe. Judge Allen's voice cracked like a whip. This confession is properly witnessed. Moreover, it explains what your superiors at Fort Keene could not, why no formal charges were ever filed against Mr. Cross despite months of detention. Lowe's face flushed dark red. Your Honor, I've heard enough. Judge Allen replaced his spectacles and straightened in his chair. This court finds Elijah Cross innocent of all accusations. He is free to go with our apologies for his unjust imprisonment. The gavel struck once, final and firm. Clara's heart soared as she watched Elias rise from the defendant's chair. He stood tall, the morning light catching the silver threads in his dark hair. With measured steps, he descended the courthouse steps, each footfall marking another moment of his freedom. At the bottom, he turned to face Clara. His golden eyes held hers, and for the first time since she'd bought his contract that autumn morning, his voice filled the air between them. You gave me back my name. The words were soft, meant for her alone, but they carried the weight of mountains. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. That evening, they sat across from each other at Clara's kitchen table, sharing a simple supper of beef stew and fresh bread. No words passed between them, but the silence was different now, soft and peaceful, like new fallen snow. The lamplight cast a gentle glow over their faces as they ate, while outside, the first stars of evening began to shine. Clara watched Elias break his bread, his movements deliberate and graceful. The wooden token Two Elks had given her still sat on the mantel beside Herbert's Bible, but now it seemed less like a mystery and more like a bridge, between past and present, between loss and hope, between two souls who had found each other in the vast spaces of the frontier. The first warm breeze of April swept across Mercy Ridge, carrying the sweet scent of wild clover. Clara and Elias worked side by side in the morning light, measuring timber for the new corral. Their movements had grown easy together over the months like a well-practiced dance. Pass me that saw? Clara wiped her brow with her sleeve. Elias handed it over without a word, though his eyes crinkled at the corners, a smile that needed no voice. The corral took shape under their hands, post by post. Neighbors began stopping by, first just to watch, then to help. Old Jim Tucker brought his tools one morning. The Jansen boys carried water. Even Roy Greeley, who'd once threatened them over water rights, arrived with a wagon of fresh-cut rails. Reckon we all misjudged some things, Greeley mumbled, not meeting their eyes. But he stayed to help, and that said more than words could. When the corral was finished, Clara noticed 3 orphaned children from the Jansen place watching them work. They'd lost their parents to fever last winter, and their aunt could barely feed them, let alone teach them letters. We could build them a schoolhouse, Clara said one evening over supper, right here on the ranch. Elias nodded, already sketching plans on a scrap of paper. His writing was still unsure, but his drawings were clear as day. Word spread. People came with lumber, nails, and willing hands. Widow Jansen brought fresh-baked bread. The Cooper family donated old readers and slates. Even Preacher Mayfield arrived with paint for the walls. The schoolhouse rose beside the new corral, a symbol of something healing in the community. Clara watched as Elias guided young Samuel Jansen's hands, showing him how to plane wood smooth. The boy who'd once feared the silent giant now followed him like a shadow. That Sunday, the little church was fuller than usual. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the wooden pews with gold. When Preacher Mayfield asked for a volunteer to read the morning scripture, Elias stood. The congregation held its breath as he walked to the front, Bible in hand. His voice, unused for so long, came out low and clear as a mountain stream. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." Clara felt tears well up as he read Psalm 34. Each word seemed to wash away another shadow of the past, like spring rain clearing winter's dust. That evening, Clara found Elias on the porch, his big hands moving steadily over a piece of wood. Curls of pine fell at his feet as his knife shaped what looked like a cradle rail, its surface smooth as silk. He didn't look up, but his shoulders relaxed as she settled into her rocking chair nearby. The sunset painted the hills in shades of purple and gold, while meadowlarks called their evening songs. They weren't courting, not in the way townfolk might recognize, but something deeper had taken root between them, like the ancient cottonwoods that grew along the creek, strong, steady, and sure of its ground. The June evening wrapped Mercy Ridge in golden light as fiddle music drifted across Clara and Elias's land. Young Sarah Cooper and Thomas Wells, the couple they'd sheltered through winter's hardship, danced their first dance as husband and wife beneath strings of lanterns hung between the cottonwoods. The entire town had turned out for the celebration. Tables groaned with covered dishes, fresh bread, roasted chicken, berry pies still warm from morning ovens. Children chased fireflies through the grass while their parents clapped along to the music. Clara stood in her doorway, taking in the scene. Just that morning, she'd found a burlap sack on the porch, filled with seed corn and fence nails. No note, but she recognized Roy Greeley's hand in the gesture. The man who'd once threatened their water rights now left gifts in the night. The thought made her smile. Sarah's white dress caught the evening light as Thomas spun her beneath the makeshift dance floor they'd built together. The young couple had arrived separately last winter, Sarah fleeing a cruel stepfather, Thomas looking for work after losing his family's farm. They'd found shelter here, and then found each other. Elias appeared beside Clara carrying 2 tin cups of cider. His presence was different now, lighter somehow, though no less steady. The silent giant who'd arrived in chains had become the man who taught children to read, who carved cradles for new mothers, who sang hymns in a voice as deep as summer thunder. They settled on the porch steps, shoulders touching. The fiddle changed to a slower tune, and more couples joined the dance. Miss Jansen, who'd once whispered about Clara's wild choice, now waved as she passed by with Preacher Mayfield. "You've come far, Mr. Cross," Clara said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. Elias's hand found hers in the growing dusk. "Because someone paid $2 to see the man under the sack." The words hung between them like a prayer of gratitude. Clara squeezed his fingers, remembering that September morning that seemed so long ago now. Later, after the last guests had gone home and the lanterns burned low, Elias walked to the barn. Clara watched from the doorway as he took down the old burlap sack that had hung on a nail since that first day. Dust fell from its rough fabric as he folded it carefully, reverently. In the garden where spring flowers had just begun to fade, a small wooden cross stood among the roses, carved by his own hands during those silent early days. Elias knelt before it, laying the folded sack at its base. The gesture spoke of endings and beginnings, of burdens laid down and new life taking root. When he returned to the porch, Clara was waiting. Together they watched the stars emerge over their land, a place that had become not just a ranch, but a sanctuary where broken things could mend, where silence could turn to song, where $2 worth of mercy could grow into something beyond measure. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.